Welcome to the Penn Museum. The concept of monumentality has been central to archaeology since its beginning. Monuments are the subject of thousands of coffee table books on archaeology and are important for archaeology courses that we teach our students. Massive amounts of stone, brick, earth are considered the physical manifestations of centralized governments and effective political economies. To V. Gordon Childe, monumental architecture was one of the key defining traits of civilization. In most archaeologists' minds, monumentality is a physical manifestation of a complex, hierarchical, and centralized authority. Large-scale monument construction in prehistoric societies lacking written records were generally assumed to be associated with states and civilizations. According to Bruce Trigger, the impracticality of monuments is their intended message. In simple cost-benefit analysis, monuments are a colossal waste of time and energy that could be dedicated to food production, shelter, and security. Monuments are highly visible, potent symbols of the elite's ability to mobilize and administer labor of the commoners that they control. Monuments are of a scale and often complexity of design and engineering that goes beyond the necessary for serving the basic needs of the peoples that built them. Monuments are considered by some to be these visible symbols of wealth and power materialized. The traditional assumption was that monuments were associated only with states, complex hierarchical political organization, although some archaeologists agree that non-state societies can build monumental works. As archaeologists, we know monumentality when we see it. Monumentality is usually defined by an arbitrary definition with references to its size, specific building materials, or comparative aesthetics. In rare cases, monuments are evaluated using energetic studies and experimental archaeology that can inform us better about the labor that was invested in them. Archaeologists, historians, and art historians of each world culture area have their own vision of what is considered monumentality. In a recent edited volume by Richard Berger and Robert Rosewig and some other colleagues, they survey monumental construction in a wide range of societies, both state and non-state, within the Americas. As the editors point out, the low earthen mound of one culture area, considered to be monumental, might be questioned by scholars working in another part of the world that has what they would consider monuments with more work that were used to build them, or possibly more aesthetically pleasing. In a seminal and somewhat cynical tongue-in-cheek article in the 1990s by Bruce Trigger, he proposed that prehistoric monumentality is characterized by its impractical, non-productive use of energy of the subjects by the elite classes to create great works of engineering, art, and scale. As highly visible constructions, these monumental works serve ideological functions that demonstrate the power of societies to conspicuously consume energy. According to Trigger and Joyce Marcus, monuments tend to be the most impressive at the dawn of states in terms of their scale and the actual available populations to build them, rather than in later societies with more resources at their command. Why would this be? Because leaders in these societies are more insecure about their powers over their subjects and the potential subjects and actually try harder. In Andean archaeology, the other hat that I wear, monumentality is considered a physical correlate of the appearance of a complex society. For the southern Andes, we are told that elite public architecture first appears in the early Horizon and early Intermediate period as stone-faced platforms with sunken temple courts like these. Through the lens of cultural evolution, the increasing scale and amount of labor invested in monumental buildings is correlated with increasing social complexity. Amazonia and the humid tropics are not what one thinks of when discussing monumentality. Of course, we are all familiar with the tropical forest monuments and civilizations of the Maya in Mexico, in Guatemala, or Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Traditionally, we thought that tropical regions, such as Amazonia, did not have the resources to build great wonders. I collect lots of these images like these. I think they're sort of spectacular for capturing sort of the emotion of the tropical forests, in this case of Brazil in Amazonia. And you can see the artist is playing around a little bit with scale. He says little itsy bitsy people like ants there, and the trees are much larger. But it does give you this impression of this sort of untouched landscape that we all love and appreciate today for its biodiversity and native cultures. But I think sometimes these images, this one's over 100 years old, stick in our heads, not just the public, but also my colleagues, thinking that it's always been this way, and that not much really happened in tropical areas such as Amazonia. And part of this is a longstanding tradition of looking at the limitations of what nature can provide. And so people often point to poor soils, and in the case of Amazonia, technology, agricultural farming technology called slash and burn or swidden agriculture that requires the cutting down of the forest, small plots usually, and you plant for a couple of years, and then you quote unquote abandon the field and move on to a new plot. And this requires large areas of forest for people to survive, and you move your villages around the landscape over time. And it's not conducive for establishing large villages, cities, and things that are the basis of most civilizations. And the technology that these peoples used was pretty simple. If you look at early civilizations through many parts of the world, they have much more sophisticated use of metals and other objects to make work easier to do the kinds of things that we recognize as civilization. Most of the digging tools used for agriculture were simple sharpened stakes of hard wood that sometimes had fire-hardened tips on them. But we do know from the archaeological record, going back to some of the first explorations, people collecting objects in Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, and other Amazonian countries, of an incredible pottery technology. And why pottery? Well, it's the only thing that's preserved in most sites in a humid climate. And one thing you notice, and they noticed also when they were collecting these are huge vessels. So these are considered to be, they're ceramic coffins. Some of them stand this tall. And this is not the kind of thing that hunters and gatherers or small, simple societies would produce and lug around, if they were doing slash and burn agriculture. And also, these are sort of pieces of art, but we also have cooking vessels, brewing vessels for making chicha or manioc beer that are huge, indicating they're serving lots of people and holding big parties, and probably we infer from those there were lots of people gathered together. We also have evidence from linguistics, and so if you trace out all of the Amazonian groups, the multitude of languages that they speak today and in the historic period, many of these have been lost, we can kind of reconstruct through historical linguistics the movements of these peoples. And they were very cosmopolitan. You had groups of people that were moving across the main valleys, settling them, farming, and then other groups would push them out later, speaking different languages in many cases, and we can document some of this in the pottery styles that the archaeologists are working with. Another couple of wake-up calls for us is a phenomenon called terra preta, or Amazonian dark earth, and it's a phenomenon that's been found in other parts of the world, but primarily in the central Amazon. And these are jet black, greasy, organic soils that we find that have no business being there. And you can see the contrast in the image on the right, James Peterson there, showing a pot, big urn coming out of the riverbank, and the black soil above, and then the traditional sort of Amazonian, that really horrible, non-productive stuff, you see that orange stuff there. And this stuff is so valuable that in the big cities along the central Amazon that feed the markets of Belém, Manaus, Santarém, big urban centers, many of the farmers, the truck farmers, operate these things, and they get incredible harvests out of this. This is a papaya plantation with two of my colleagues, Brazilian colleagues, and showing the contrast between these human-created soils and the the natural soils. And what they're doing is they're incorporating all kinds of organic matter intentionally, and literally tons and tons and tons of charcoal that has all kinds of magical characteristics of changing soil, providing all kinds of opportunities for microorganisms that are beneficial for production and fertility of soils to survive. And so essentially these are human-created soils. Another colleague of mine, Michael Heckenberger, is working, he decided he'd work in an area no one worked before, in the upper Xingu area, where people were telling him, oh, you're not gonna find anything up there, why go up there and waste your time? And he found incredible things, and he's been publishing a lot on this. This is from Scientific American, an article that he did of huge villages. Each one of those little houses there probably holds about 40 to 50 people. These are large, look like armories or something, giant structures. And roadways that go out from these settlements to other settlements. Most of these are avenues that are almost as wide as the central bank of seats here, with curbs along them, some of them perfectly straight, some not, that go to the next big urban center and to the next one. And after he surveyed for a decade or so in this area with his team, Brazilian team, and students, he found that all of the big sites are lined on an axis, not perfectly north-south, but pretty close to it. And then perfect 90 degrees off of this are located smaller sites, all connected by roadways. So this indicates that these aren't little, simple, autonomous little communities, but they're interacting on a broad urban design, you could say. Then the other thing, the subject of this talk, are what we call geoglyphs or ring ditches, ditched enclosures. Closures have been many, many different names used for them. And these were first discovered over 100 years ago by some ethnographers and early archaeologists. But it wasn't until fairly recently, in the late 80s, that Ansu Ranzi started staring at Google Earth and some pre-Google Earth imagery and found, we now know that some 400 of these have been found in one state, the state of Acre in Bolivia, in Brazil, that borders on Bolivia, the area I'm talking about. And these are just beautiful works, geometric shapes dug into the ground to be appreciated. Well, today we find them because the ranchers are clearing off the dense tropical forest, but we assume that many of these, probably all of them, would have been exposed when they were built and in use. And we'll look at some of the implications of that in a few minutes. The ones I'll show you from Bolivia aren't quite as beautiful in terms of symmetry, but we have more of them, I think, and also much larger ones that you'll see in a few minutes. Most of us that do archaeology in the Amazon region are also interested in the environment. And one of the things that archaeology can do is to tell us something about if humans had something to do with the environment, their role over long periods of time, thousands of years, to sort of say how biodiversity happened, and especially in the areas that we appreciated today. And we kind of assumed that those are areas where there were no humans, but we're finding more and more that humans play an important role. So my colleagues and I are also historical ecologists, and we're interested in this long, complex human history of environments. And so most records that we have that historians work with go back maybe a couple hundred years, some areas thousands of years, but they're usually not writing about the environment in those cases. But archaeology provides an incredible window for looking at these things. And as you'll see, monumentality plays an important role in shaping and defining what we see and appreciate today in the tropical areas of Bolivia. Also, as an archaeologist, I study stuff. If people didn't leave something for me to study, I don't have a job. And so what we try to do is to sort of make sense of that stuff. And most, you're familiar with the talks here at Penn, their collections, pottery, lithics, and sometimes perishable materials, gold, silver. But landscapes themselves also hold incredible records. And so in a sense, if humans did something over and over again, more than once, let's say, repetitively, like walk from their house to their fields, or go visit their neighbors. All this stuff eventually